Welcome to our first session of the Socio-Economic Perpetual Online Conference. We have a very exciting hour and a half ahead of us. But before we start, I would like to give Hiroki Tanikawa from Nagoya University, who is the SEM Section Chair, the opportunity to give some opening remarks to this session and to the conference actually too. So Hiroki, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tomel. I hope everybody being safe under the current circumstances around the COVID-19 situation. On behalf of the ISI SEM is socio-economic metabolism section. I really appreciate that you all joining this meeting. And actually, we originally planned the 2020 ISI SEM conference in Sendai, Japan, in this September. But as you know, because of this COVID-19 situations, the current this conference has been postponed, and we, as a board members of SEM, we try to find how to keep having the communications of SEM. So now we are very happy to have an online ISISEM conference, and this conference style is very challenging because we set perpetual conference, which is that we try to hold one special session in each month online. So, and we already set several sessions every month until end of this year. So maybe please keep watching ISA website. Maybe we will announce very soon. And today we have very hot topic related to the COVID-19 and SEM. I'm very thrilled to joining it. And I hope all of you have more interested about industrial ecology and also the socioeconomic metabolism research. And please enjoy the perpetual conference. Thank you very much. Tomel.
Okay, thank you very much, Hiroki, for these opening remarks. Now we're about to start our session. My name is Tomer Fishman, and I'm from the IDC Herzliya. And I will chair this session online. It's a bit of a challenge juggling. I currently have 3 screens here in parallel, one with the YouTube stuff, one with the Zoom and everything else. We'll see how it goes. But we have a very exciting session ahead of us. The way it's going to work is that the schedule is that we will have basically 3 presenters. Each will speak for about 15 minutes, and we will have 5 minutes for simple questions and answers immediately after each presentation, which is going to leave us with about 10 minutes in the end for a general discussion to see how it all fits together. I recommend for people to save their discussion questions to that stage. You can also use the chat feature or connected through Zoom to also write comments or ask questions in real time. We will use the Q&A and the discussion time to read out those questions or give you the opportunity to do so in order to kickstart the discussion going. So I think without further ado, we will give the stage to our first speaker for today, which is Benjamin Sprecher from Leiden University, who is going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the resource extraction sector, short-term and structural effects. So, Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tomer. Let's first do the obligatory, does the screen share thing work? Does it work? Great, it works. All right, so hi everyone. First of all, I'm kind of honored that I get to kick off this perpetual online conference, right? It's a really cool idea, and I'm very happy to participate. And what I'll be doing is I will be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the resource extraction sector, so just the mining companies, short-term and structural effects. And I'm doing this research together with the World Bank. They have a climate smart mining program where they try to get the mining sector to be more climate smart, which basically means more environmentally friendly. And in this context, they do a lot of research, and they asked me to do some research just on what's happening with COVID-19. I'm Benjamin Sprecher, assistant professor at Leiden University at the CML. So just very short about the methods. Methods are very simple. So on the one hand, literature review, just read everything that's out there. A lot of companies have put out press releases, and there are some analysis reports already on what the impact is. And we also did semi-structured interviews in Chatham House style with major mining companies, so Anglo American, Lynas, BHP, Rio Tinto, the really big ones. Also spoke to some consultants, and I interviewed some academics just because, you know, I feel we shouldn't be left out in this kind of research. Chatham House rules was really important, so then the mining companies could speak freely, and this basically, I'm sure everyone knows, but it basically means that I can say who was participating in the research, but I can't say who said exactly what. So just to set the stage a bit, COVID-19 and the mining sector, I just collected some random headlines. I mean, everyone has been in this pandemic, so we all kind of know what it feels like, but for the mining sector, it was moderately disruptive. So there are some headlines like this, like coronavirus closes the Mponeng gold mine in South Africa. It's the deepest mine in the world. So you can imagine you're 3 kilometers underground, and then someone starts coughing. You're like, oh, that's bad. Another one, COVID-19 in the Polish mining sector, the coal mining sector, heaps further pain on already struggling sector. And this is my favorite headline. Putin sends the army to fight virus outbreak, right? Because everywhere else in the world, it's the virus and personal protection equipment, etc., etc. But in Russia, it's Putin who sends in the army to fight the virus. So what happened previously, also just to give an idea of what kind of things could you talk about in terms of disruptions in the mining sector. These are like tantalum in the corner. On the bottom, we have 2 cobalt disruptions, like in the 70s and 2007, and in the upper right corner, neodymium price. This is all price peaks. So in 2011, 2012 for neodymium, it's like this order of magnitude increase in price because there was a supply disruption. So that's interesting, right? So these disruptions are obviously much smaller than the pandemic, and yet they had really large impacts on at least the price of these metals. So then naively you would expect that currently the impact of this much bigger disruption is also much bigger. But you know what happened now? I have a lot of once the report gets published, you know, there's a lot of data in there. I just took a couple of these data points. I think let's start with the lithium price. So this is the lithium price between 2017 and 2020. You can see it just goes down, and there's hardly any impact from the pandemic. Okay, then the copper price here is, you do see quite an impact from the pandemic, like a steep drop around March, but then actually it just climbs back up again, and now the copper price currently is almost at the same level as it was before, like a year ago. So that's also interesting. Flake graphite supply, so graphite flakes, you need them to make batteries. And you can see that actually the supply of this stuff in China dropped quite a lot around February, but then the rest of the world, so the light blue bar, kind of grows a bit, so that picks up. So the overall disruption in supply wasn't that big. There was some, it went down a bit, but not too much. And with cobalt, you see even less effect. So here it's per year, 2018 to 2030, and one of the consultants we spoke with, they expected that there was a 7% year-over-year drop in this year, but overall it's basically nothing. So, okay, we can talk about why that happened later, but also why did this price kind of not react all that badly, or why did it go down at least and not up like in previous disruptions? Mostly because there was a demand disruption more than a supply disruption. So you have less supply, but demand went down all the way to zero. So this graph in the corner shows the Chinese production of new energy vehicles, so battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. And around February, it's almost zero. So of course the price goes down instead of up if the supply goes down more than demand. So that's interesting, different than previous disruptions that we looked at. And then I will highlight for the rest of the presentation some short-term disruption, like effects, and then some long-term effects. I think one of the most interesting short-term effects was actually that mines had to interact much more with their local communities. So mines are critical to local economies often, so they were allowed to operate. But also you see that if you talk to these mining companies, the better their relationship was with the local communities, the easier it was for them to keep working. So these mines really saw that it pays off a lot to have a good relationship with your local community. And it kind of went the other way around. Mines are used to working with, and basically mine is a very dangerous environment for a human. So they were used to working with PPE and how to deal with safety. And they actually shared a lot of this knowledge with the communities around them. And they put a lot of effort into helping communities deal with COVID-19. So here there's a quote from a CEO says it was far more likely for a mine worker to get sick in the community than at the mine. So they actually went into the community, put a lot of effort into making these communities safe. And that is quite unique. Like this doesn't happen all the time. It actually did happen before with Ebola crisis. The mines played a really large role in helping the villages around the mine deal with Ebola, because the local government basically collapsed at a certain point and just couldn't deal with it, and the mines were like, all right, we step in. So that's an interesting dynamic. Short term, you also had some limited shifts in supply chains. So what, at least in my research, I always find that substitution is a really large thing that happens. Like if I can't get my material from one source, I just get it from another source. And this happened like with iron ore, for instance, in Brazil. Currently, the pandemic is quite intense, and there were some operational disasters before. So the supply of iron ore from Brazil went down a lot. And then Australia just said, okay, well, we can sort of provide that anyway instead of Brazil. So they kind of, some people lose, some people win. But actually, it's quite hard, especially for minor metals. Like you want to switch your lithium source, that can take up to 12 months, which of course a lot longer than you have if you have a pandemic. And these industries are very relationship based. So if I already work with someone for 10 years, I can't just find someone else on a dime, like open the phone book and find someone else to provide my indium. So that kind of limits your substitution in the short term. And what also happened a lot, and is kind of like, sad, but you can kind of expect it to happen, is that mining companies, they never waste a good crisis, so they really pushed for things to happen that normally would have not been able to happen. Like there are many examples. I just like took quotes from two of them. Like in Australia, they replaced the parliament with a committee full of mining people, and they fast-tracked a whole bunch of environmental regulations and project assessments and corporate tax, blah blah blah, tax cuts, and that's nobody can protest this because you're all sitting inside. Same happened in Indonesia. Was a contested mining law that was not passed last year because of there was massive protest, and now you can't, or at least you couldn't go protesting all that much. So then they just passed the law anyway, and this is a really bad law that really harms, at least potentially harms the environment and communities around these mines. And there are many examples like this where like, ooh, okay, this is not necessarily very nice. Then to go to long-term effects. So this is a lot more uncertain, right? Like we have no idea what the long-term effects are, but I think there are some interesting trends that you can see. So on the one hand, like I mentioned, these mining companies, they really saw that having good relationships with local communities pays off. So they all said that they would invest more in that in the future. So interaction with local communities could become better. But at the same time, a recession will cause these communities to lean much harder on mining companies to share profits. And if you get into a zero-sum game situation, that's never good for relationships, right? So there are two kind of opposing trends that are both true and both happening at the same time. Kind of hard to say which one will win out in the end. Another interesting contradiction is market concentration. So on the one hand, economic crisis in general, but this pandemic in particular, tends to lead to market concentration. So more power and more supply from the big companies. And this is for two reasons. So one reason is financial. If there's a recession, it's really hard for small companies to get the money that you need to open a new mine. And mining is incredibly capital intense, and or you have to pay all the money up front and you recoup your investment in 20 years. So the really big mining companies, they can keep building new mines, but the really small ones, the junior mining companies, they're basically out of luck. And for the next couple of years, you'll see that there'll be less new mines coming from new companies. But what will happen is that big companies just buy the small companies because they can afford it. And at the same time, you also see that big companies can just weather a pandemic much better. So there was one company gave the example that they're so big they can have 3 alternative supply chains at the same time because they have the management capacity to keep that up. But all the smaller companies in the same area that were mining the same stuff, they could only afford one supply chain. So when that one supply chain was actually disrupted by the pandemic, then all the small companies were out of luck, but the big company just said, okay, we'll just export our material via a different port. And then you can kind of tell that customers, they want that type of security. So they will start buying from the big mining companies more and sign contracts with them because they can guarantee that they have more options when it comes to pandemics. At the same time, you see there's a increased risk awareness. So I did my PhD on this, so I'm always, of course, very surprised that other people are not aware of supply constraints and supply risks. But sadly, the rest of the world is less interested in this topic. But what you do see is that because everyone kind of saw this happening, right? Like all of our medical equipment and pharmaceutical ingredients, they come from India and China, and this was a problem. Then here's a nice quote at the bottom from a member of parliament from the European Parliament. She says, well, European Union's problematic dependence on third countries for pharmaceutical ingredients and medical supplies. And then, crucially, this link, looking ahead, we should be equally worried about raw materials for the Green Deal. So you can see that this experience with the pandemic kind of makes it clear to everyone that there's a problem with supply concentration. So on the one hand, you get more concentration. On the other hand, you get awareness that this is not good. So maybe some action against it. And finally, from environmental point of view, there's like negative trends. So the junior mining companies that have no money, like I mentioned before, they will cut corners, and cutting corners in the mining industry always means that the environment loses. And at the same time, countries will start to ignore environmental protection laws to jumpstart the economies. Like you already see that happening too. On the other hand, there's this trend of increased awareness of environmental issues by consumers. And the mining companies indicated that this awareness kind of filters down to them through the supply chain and then puts some pressure on them to behave nicely. So those are two competing trends. Who knows which one will win out? And then to summarize, 3 short-term trends: more and better interaction between mine and community, supply substitution, that happened, not 100%, but it did happen, and opportunistic behavior by mining companies that potentially could be really structural, like these mining laws that will govern the mining industry in countries for decades to come. That's a really big change in the status quo that just happened now. And on the structural side, supply concentration, more or less, local communities, relationships, better or worse, and environmental performance of the mining industry on the long term might be better, might be worse because of this pandemic. And that was it. So thank you for listening. I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much, Benjamin.
Great.
Really interesting talk. I would like to invite Vered Blas from Tel Aviv University um, to give us a talk about consumption and recycling behavior before and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, insights from Israeli survey and the implications for future industrial ecology research. So thank you, Vered. Whenever.
Hi. Thank you first, Tomer, for inviting me to participate and present. I appreciate that a lot. Maybe because the floor is mine, I can say two quick comments on the comments before with Benjamin. One, there is a series of reports by the OECD that show what governments are kind of, in some countries, do release environmental requirements from companies, and they are tracking it to see. So that's on the side of would they get some discount here now because of the situation. And on the last line, Benjamin, when you wrote about the last item about would consumers or the population will ask more, for more environmental consideration or less. Actually, in the survey that I'm gonna share with you now, we also looked, I'm not gonna talk about this in this presentation, but we also looked on the intention to change eco-activism and to press more for, request for more environmental aspect. And we actually showed that people were kind of suggesting they will maintain the level that they do now, they will not increase it. So it's a question about, would we now be able to ask for more or not because of the pandemic, because of the economic consequences, etc. in the short term, of course. But thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I will take you now to a bit of a different road. This walk is still in progress, and it is done with my colleague from Bar-Ilan University, also here in Israel, Anna Chechik. And we were basically interested to start understanding if the pandemic is going to create any changes in environmental behavior and recycling specifically. We also looked at mobility issues and eco-activism, but that's, I'm not going to talk about it today. And basically the motivation for this was first that, of course, thanks to the pandemic, we are having this sudden and rapid change in real rapid change in behavior and consumption patterns. And beside, no travel and working from home and all of these big aspects, there are also many different aspects related specifically to, I think, what we are more interested at, which is consumption patterns and recycling activities. So, if we move to mainly online shopping with all of the consequences of that, we use more consumables, if it's the gloves, and here you see, the disposable masks that unfortunately are now everywhere where you go in the streets. These boxes, sorry, it's in Hebrew, but this shows the situation on my balcony at the moment, because the farmer where I get my vegetables every week used to take back the boxes and reuse them again and again. But now, since the pandemic started, they are not taking it back anymore. So, the best case is that every few weeks we are so out of space that we take it to the local recycling, cardboard recycling containers. But it means that they are not getting reused at the moment, but only recycled. And of course, many people, use that opportunity of the lockdown to do home cleanups, and then there is a lot of waste or unused items that came out as big streams of waste and needs to be dealt with. Okay. And of course, this raised the questions, are we in front of a turning point? Do people see now the connection to climate crisis? Do they recognize the connection between the pandemic or climate crisis? Do they think there is? Do we start thinking differently on having control or not having control on nature? And we have all kind of sets of questionnaires to, to actually look at that. And of course, the aftermath or the post-pandemic, which seems far still, but, and Benjamin also talked about the Green Deal and other, what governments are going to do on economy build-up strategies, and would they change their mindset? Would they go more through the green growth path, or they're going to say, forget about environmental issues and we need to first take care of the economy? So I think this is interesting times, and from this we come up with a set of questions that we are only starting to answer. We are mainly asking them yet. And the idea also here, and I say upfront here, that it's also an open invitation, and I will finish with a slide on future research, of course, for collaboration within the group and other groups with the IE community. So first one, are we really up to a change in beliefs, attitudes, and behavior related to environmental aspects? And again, more interested at the moment in consumption and recycling patterns. The other side of the equation, which is the industry, so the first question is more about the general population and the consumers. The second question is more related to industry. What are the good practices that we can actually keep after the pandemic? So some of them created a big economic loss, which of course, does not align with the decoupling that we want to see, that, there is still economic growth and less environmental impacts, but there are some practices that were still good for the economy and also good for the environment, and try to identify those and how we can maybe maintain them. So that's a separate work that we are currently doing with industry participation. And at the end, the last question, which is much broader, is what are the implications of those trends, either at the consumption side or the production and industry side, that can lead us to interesting follow-up research using our methods, different consequences on urban metabolism, differences in recycling flows, and of course also, I think consequential LCA more related to the consumption patterns and the end of life, and how they will, what will change based on those changes of the pandemic. Okay, so our first study is basically an online survey that we did, a snowball survey during March and April, which was the lockdown, the first lockdown. We are almost ready for a second one, it seems like, but the first lockdown period that we had in Israel here. It was a very quick try to do something while the things are happening. We didn't really know how long it will last, and we were able to get 420 respondents, but at the end we used only 300 of those that were really complete and we made sense, and that did a big effort to answer everything. It was targeted at the Israeli adult population. We also had a special treatment, so almost a quarter of the sample got an information treatment about correlation between air pollution and rate deaths related to the COVID-19. It was based on a recent Harvard study, and we wanted to check also the intervention of providing specific information and how this might affect our changing in behavior in the future. So we had this very long questionnaire that helped us basically to gather different type of data. First, environmental attitudes using the NEP questionnaire, which basically help us to divide people to 3 types of groups. The one that are really ecocentric, understand, and much more environmentally, pro-environmental, middle, that they don't think that nature is, you can tweak to make us live here better. And then the last one that are really only cares about themselves pretty much and think that nature is here to serve us. And then we had different measurements of past, or for us, past pro-environmental behavior that we checked from before the pandemic, and the same items on intention to change, to maintain them, to increase or to decrease the activity in each of those items. And of course, we need to remember that this is like a stated behavior. We don't know if they will really do it. We just ask them, are they gonna, what do they think they will do in the future? Which is of course also a limitation, and I will talk about it. We also asked them about all kinds of personal attitudes and knowledge related to the pandemic, to climate change, to the connection between them. Are they more concerned now with things like climate change? And of course, the demographics and the loss of income, which was very important, of course, was also captured. And we know that our sample is slightly biased compared to the representative sample of Israel, but specifically towards environmental orientation, it was not it was not biased. We tested it against older samples that we had results for on the net to look if the distribution is more or less the same, and we saw that it's actually not biased. It was biased a bit on the average age, on the percentage of women versus men, but not on what was important for us, which was the environmental orientation. So now I will quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, I just want to quickly share a few results, but then go to implications and future research. So for sure, a big part of our sample actually suffered from a loss of income. More than 17%, so 17.5% actually had a severe loss of income, or high or very high loss. But we see that still most of the sample had some type of a loss. Only the first column is the one that did not suffer. However, most of them thought that it is very temporary, and they are expected to get back to normal when this pandemic is over. Again, of course, no one knew then, because we thought, oh, it will be 2 months and that's it. But of course, now reality is different. But people were quite optimistic that they will at least get back to what they had before. Here you can see the frequency of the respondents based on how they are gonna change their behavior on recycling and reducing consumption. And we actually divided them to 3 segments. So if I was a light recycler, a medium recycler, or heavy recycler before, and what I intend to do in that category, am I going to maintain it or increase my activity or even decrease it? So for reducing consumption, meaning buy less and do more reuse and think more carefully about the things that I'm buying, we had mainly maintain or increase, but a bit of decrease, while for the recycling, it was only maintaining or increasing. There was almost no indication on decreasing. So we did first, just a general statistic summary, but then we also got into more complicated econometrics models, and we also had issues with correlations between variables, and we needed to use instruments to overcome that. And at the end, we wanted to test the intention to change the pro-environmental behavior under different dimensions. As I said, recycling, consumption, and also mobility and activism, which we didn't show. Okay. Really main results, okay? So among them, I don't really just want to read it out loud, but it's quite a lot. So basically the first line, you see what type of parameters affected most what we frame as willingness to increase the intensity. So both behaviors, recycling and a reduction of consumption. So of course, my environmental attitude, the income loss was of course very important, increased fear of climate change, and knowledge about the link between the crisis, air pollution, and climate crisis was also important. When we separated to 2 different behaviors, we saw that actually the lighter recyclers, so those that so far did not recycle so much, and it was by categories, it was electronic waste and paper and glass, it was divided, and we just did at the end PCA for recycling, for all recycling activities. So the light recycler were actually most likely to increase the recycling activity, followed by the medium, and of course it makes sense because the heavier recyclers are already doing a lot and they have less room for improvement. But it was very encouraging to see that actually people that didn't recycle so much before are planning to do more now. For the consumption reduction, it was more the medium reduction consumption that were actually in higher probability to increase their behavior, which also means that the ones that are already somehow pursued are now even more pursued and more convinced to change and go in that direction. But it's important to remember that this behavior is also directly related with money saving. So therefore, we saw a much more significant effect of the income loss on the consumption reduction prediction versus the recycling, because it makes sense. If you need to save now money, the reduction in consumption will help you with that, while recycling most likely not, because you don't usually get money for it, maybe the deposit back, but not more than that. Okay. We also found that the concern over climate change is higher with those that are ecocentric that lost income. So basically the combination of those that were eco-friendly before and lost income, they were actually now way more concerned on climate change. Okay, we're also able to do all kind of predictive margin based on the regression result to understand more the effect of each component or each parameter on each other. But we can see basically on the left side that basically we are most likely to increase the reduction of consumption as we are more concerned about climate change, and also as we are suffered more from the income loss. And on the right side, I don't have the time to get into it, but we were also looking on this information treatment that I briefly talked about. Basically, if you add any type of internal information before your own knowledge versus no knowledge versus the knowledge that we added to the quarter of the sample, how would that affect the likelihood that you will change your behavior? And we see that while in the reduction of the behavior, okay, sorry, the reduction of consumers, the light ones were the least to be affected from the information. On recycling, it was actually the highest. So those that are currently light recyclers, more information will help them to even further increase the likelihood of doing more recycling. So it's important also to consider that when you now want to maybe promote recycling in the aftermath. Okay, so sorry for running so fast on the results, but just to make sure we stand in the time here. So implication, basically we suggest that we take this pandemic as an opportunity to further educate the public on the relation of such events and also provide them with different mechanisms to educate themselves, because providing information actually makes a difference. We need to think how we can advance recycling infrastructure if we think that more portion of the population, those lighter recyclers will start now doing it more. And of course, and that's very specific to Israel, the industry, the recycling industry in Israel is really in a very slow mode in Israel and not able to, to rise up. And actually this is an encouraging message for the industry that there is actually more willingness, and there will be even more willingness to the public to participate in recycling activities. And therefore we need to think how to get ready for that. Of course, we have a lot of limitations. This is just the first part of our study. It's only Israeli sample, not even, representative, fully representative. And the main thing is that we looked at intended change and not actual observed change, which we plan to do as a future work. And that leads me to the last slide, and also to open for the discussion later. So first, we are up to duplicating the survey in other countries. We are working to get some funding for it at the moment. And what's nice is that we already have, from previous not related studies that we did, all of the data on the actual attitudes of people. The NEP questionnaire, we have it from before, and we can go back to the same people and ask them again now about the attitude and see if it's actually changed over time. And of course, to compare the other questions on the intention to change behavior across other countries. We also plan to complement this with actual real data from the recycling industry in Israel, so mainly the collection infrastructure companies, to actually get some weights of recyclables over time and see that if that changed in the last few months. And of course, we need to give a bit more time for it before we do it. The part with the industry, I don't gonna get into it now, but we are actually in the middle of finalizing a survey and getting now a pilot with industry through all kinds of networks that we have with the industry. And finally, and this is where I want to maybe save that for the discussion later, but really understand and think about how we can use this type of initial work to guideline additional work that is interesting for our community much broadly. So first, what can we learn from those small surveys? Can they lead us in a certain direction to think about more specific questions? And of course, with recycling, I think it's definitely very relevant. And I saw that one of the last questions was about also urban mining, and one of the comments of the audience, and how can we, based on that, maybe do more work. and of course the consequences on all of those changes over time. What does it mean from stocks and flows, from our consumption patterns, maybe the use phase in LCAs will change, of course the end of life options, maybe much less reuse and more recycling, and this type of questions. So that's what I have for you today. I think I make it on time, Tomer.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Vered. A very interesting topic too. Let's open up the floor for some comments and questions. Let's see who wants to go first. Helmut, I see you're raising your hand.
Many thanks, Vered, for this presentation. In my view, one of the most obvious impacts of COVID on the daily life of many people has been that they have reduced their commute to work. So have you also looked at changes in mobility pattern linked to COVID-19, or do you plan to do so? Because I think that may perhaps be among the largest impacts.
Yes, so I started by saying that, the impacts that I talked to you are relevant to the day, the consumption and recycling. But yes, of course, mobility is a big issue. We actually asked about it in that survey. We just thought it's too much categories, to discuss. And I thought that for this forum, it's more relevant, but we already have data on this. And also, if we will see, if we get it, but we are trying to design now, and we actually submit a proposal here for looking more specifically on the differences and the changes that need to take place in mobility systems so people use them. For example, now, if I will not want to share so much because hygiene problems, so maybe some of the sharing infrastructure or platform will need to change the way they walk, or already we see in Israel, many cities say that they are going to block some of the streets to get more space for the restaurants. So like to have it like closer for roads so they can put more table out. So that's going to change mobility within the center cities. So all kind of trends related to that. And of course, working from home and all of the implications of that, which we try to now facilitate some work with Tel Aviv municipality around that. So yes, but that's kind of a separate topic. But yes, we are doing that. And I will be very happy to collaborate and maybe do similar work in different cities and then compare also, policies and results.
I would like to invite Helmut Haber, who is going to present in collaboration with Dominic Wiedenhofer on the topic of lessons for crisis recovery from a systematic review of the evidence on decoupling. So Helmut, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so many thanks. So basically this is not directly research on COVID, and I have to present it alone because unfortunately the son of Dominic has become sick. We hope it's only a cold and not COVID, but who knows? Anyway, very likely it's only a cold. So anyway, I will give this presentation alone, but it's based on a large systematic review process, and Tomer has also been part of that. We've been invited to do that by Felix Kreutzig, who is one of the CLAs for the new IPCC chapter on demand-side solutions. Yeah, and this should contribute to this IPCC chapter as well. Basically so I think there's lots of research that people in this room will know how humanity is moving towards unsustainability, and it's all related to use of biophysical resources, materials and energy. And this is just some examples for the trends we see over the last century that, if they continue, will of course mess up the climate, for example, and we know all about that. So one big issue in this community, as you certainly also know, is whether there is a possibility of decoupling GDP growth from the use of resources, which would be called resource decoupling, or from environmental impacts, like, for example, greenhouse gas emissions that then lead to climate change, but of course many other environmental impacts as well. So there is this distinction between relative decoupling, where GDP grows faster, but resource use or emissions still grow, and absolute decoupling, where resource use declines while GDP grows. And of course, if we want to aim at targets like the Paris Agreement, we have to do very, very strong absolute decoupling, as greenhouse gases have been to be reduced to zero until 2050, and probably to negative emissions in the second half of the century. So we need very strong absolute decoupling. So what we did is we did a systematic review of the evidence in the literature on decoupling of GDP from resource use and greenhouse gas emissions. And we did a query which we submitted to the Web of Science and to Scopus, and you see the query on the slide. It yielded something like 14,000 references, and after duplicate removal, it were 11,500 references. We did an expert solicitation for the additional literature. And we did a first screening for relevance based on title, abstract, and keywords, giving us 1,200 references, a double blind, and then we ended up with 835 references, including 8 reviews that we analyzed in depth, where we did a bibliometric mapping of the literature and a content analysis. And all of this is published in 2 papers in Environmental Research Letters. It came out only a few weeks ago. Here you see some information on the bibliometric mapping. You see, for example, in the upper graph, the focus of the studies. So there is some part of the studies and also the development through time. There are some studies on greenhouse gas emissions, on CO2 emissions, on final energy, primary energy, exergy, and materials and energy, so the industrial ecology stuff. There is a graph showing the geographic scope of the different studies. So we have national, international, meaning several countries, and global, meaning most or all countries globally. And you also see on the right-hand side the scope of the indicators. We looked at production or territorial indicators, or consumption-based / footprint indicators. And you see that most of the studies are production-based or territorial, and only a small part consumption-based or footprint indicators. Yeah, I think perhaps I should switch over that, because otherwise I will not be able to cope with the time. So you see some keywords and the conceptual angles of the research. So what were the insights from part 1, which is mostly the systematic literature review and the literature mapping? There is often a too limited scope of the studies. So there's a very large literature, for example, coming from economics, doing very elaborated econometric stuff, but lacking any idea on the thermodynamic and biophysical meaning. So they don't even discuss which energy indicator they use. They just say, well, we looked at energy versus GDP, and then you have to go trace back their the references to even see what kind of energy indicator, whether this was primary energy or final energy or whatnot. And there is often, so there's a large focus on the territorial or production-based side of things. Many studies have a very simplistic point of view about statistic causality and neoclassical growth theory. So there is a lot of studies that also look very similar, that are only interested in this kind of causality, or actually it's Granger causality, so statistical causality between energy and GDP. And there's also, there are disparate discourses. So there's the quantitative statistical analysis of decoupling is too often decoupled from critical discussion. about the meaning of economic growth on a finite planet. And there's also a relatively large literature that is actually not really interested in environmental issues. It's just as energy as a factor of production they are interested in. Yeah, and now the second part, this is the second article where we try to synthesize the evidence for these 800 studies. We structured the literature into two large parts. So most of the literature, we did not do an in-depth analysis of all the papers. You can imagine it's quite difficult to really do an in-depth analysis of 835 papers. So for the large literatures on primary energy and territorial CO2 emissions, there have been recent review papers, and we just summarized them and put them in context with a few selected recent publications. And most of the effort went into doing in-depth analysis of the literature on three areas, which were final and useful energy and useful exergy. Then the industrial ecology style literature, so comprehensive measures of material and energy flows. And we had one third part on decoupling of GDP from total GHG emissions and greenhouse gas footprints. So the difference being what we did not look at in depth is those studies that only looked at CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. But we had an in-depth look at studies looking at the full range of greenhouse gases, including the land use change and land cover change related CO2 emissions, and the other greenhouse gases like NOx or CH4 and others, and the greenhouse gas footprints. So, and I can't go into detail. There are huge tables that summarize the findings of each and every study we looked at in these three topic areas in the paper. So if you want to have an in-depth look, you're very much invited to look at the paper. It's free online, so you can access it very easily. So for this large part, the primary energy and territorial CO2, we find that most studies point at the long-run co-integration of GDP and primary energy, but the direction of the granular causality is very unclear and controversial, but it's very clear that energy is an important factor of production, and there's little support for the EKC hypothesis. For final energy and useful energy and exergy, there is a strong evidence that GDP and exergy is strongly coupled. So, and the decoupling that is found between primary energy and GDP is largely related to increases in energy efficiency, the conversion efficiency from primary energy to useful exergy. For the material and energy flow literature, relative decoupling is quite frequent. So, of course, it's not universal. There are some different cases, but in most cases, you find relative decoupling and reductions or stagnation. So what we need to absolutely reduce resource use or greenhouse gases. If this happens, it often happens only on the territorial side, on the production related indicators, but it is often associated with rising trade or footprints related with trade. And for the total greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas footprints, we also find relative decoupling quite frequently. There's very, very few econometric studies on that. And footprint studies often find emission shifts abroad, but there also exist some examples for absolute decoupling for both territorial and footprint indicators. We also had a look at how these studies related to the green growth versus degrowth tension in the literature. So for that, we did a text analysis of a random subsample of 15% of all publications, I think 125, and did a text analysis of introduction and conclusions. About 70% contained policy recommendations, 30% did not have any policy recommendations. About 64% of the studies were clearly related to a green growth paradigm, and only a very small portion of the studies were related to a degrowth or growth agnostic perspective. So we included in these 3% studies that were not clearly favoring degrowth, but were saying, well, but it's perhaps more important to reduce resource use or emissions than to continue with GDP growth. And there were quite a few studies who were interested in completely different issues and did not relate to this debate at all. Okay, so we also did some compilation of resource and emission elasticities in the last 10 years. So TPS is total primary energy supply, final energy materials, CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and we divided it in higher income and lower income countries. And you see for the lower income countries, we always find elasticities near 1. So usually, whether you look at production-based, which means PB, or consumption-based, which is CB, you will find a relation of 1 to 1. So 1% of growth, GDP growth, requires 1% more of these resources or emissions. For the higher income countries, you find lower elasticities. And the only case where we find close to zero elasticity is production-based total greenhouse gas emissions. So, but of course, you know, for the Paris Agreement, we need to have a very strongly, if we want to reach the Paris Agreement while having a lot of GDP growth, we need to have strongly negative income elasticity of greenhouse gas emissions. So we don't find strong evidence for that. So for the past, and we focused in this systematic review on the past, we find that useful exergy and GDP are tightly coupled. The energy decoupling mainly results from increasing conversion efficiency from primary energy to useful exergy. Past material flows of stock building materials have substantial legacies for the future. So it's very important to distinguish dissipative use of resources from stock building and piling up material stocks like buildings, infrastructures, machinery, and long-lived consumer goods. There's no evidence that EKCs would save the planet. And there is some evidence on peak and decline countries in terms of CO2 emissions. A study that looked at both production and consumption-based CO2 emissions that found that policies can achieve some CO2 decoupling, but so far this has not been sufficient for ambitious climate targets. And if we look into the future, and this is kind of the message in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, so if we want to, for example, cope with the Paris Climate Agreement and strive towards a 1.5 degree target, we really need to change these interrelations, the systemic interrelations between flows of energy and materials, the stocks we build up by using those, the buildings, the infrastructures, and the machinery, and the services and well-being contributions we derive from that. So a low carbon transition will really have to have large-scale changes in that, and not just improvements in technical efficiencies. So our conclusion was that the window for avoiding catastrophic climate change and mitigating biodiversity loss and other sustainability crises is closing in the next decade. And a focus on the demand side is really crucial. And this means we have to think in systemic solutions. This also means we have to think and especially, you know, we have this economic recession in all the countries triggered by the COVID crisis, and the policies that we are implemented now for economic recovery, and especially the investment policies, are of crucial importance. In what kind of infrastructure patterns do we invest? So do we invest into transport saving settlement patterns, into low carbon commuting patterns? So in addition to traditional instruments like eco-taxes, command and control measures, we need to focus on investment policies. And of course, there is, as you all know, this discussion on degrowth and perhaps limiting the growth of affluence, high consumption, inequality, also the discussion on divestment into fossil fuel infrastructures and all these kinds of discussions that become very important here. Yeah, thank you very much. This was my presentation, and sorry for the interruption. And I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion and try to find the, stopping the slideshow so that we can discuss better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helmut. So now I would like to open the floor for a general discussion about all three presentations and about the topic in general. So in total, we had three great talks about different aspects that socioeconomic metabolism deals with, from the supply side through the consumer's side, and also looking at the grand macro scale viewpoint of decoupling long term and on the national and global scale, which all connect together to showcase how our field of research, industrial ecology and socioeconomic metabolism specifically, can deal with these aspects that are very up to date, like the COVID-19 crisis. So let's see if we can get maybe some comments or discussion or questions about the general aspect of how does socioeconomic metabolism support COVID-19, not just research, but also, well, saving the world in general. Does anyone want to start?
It's a tough question.
Well, I think this is one of the biggest disruptions we have seen, in the trajectory of societies, at least in the industrialized world, but probably also the developing world. And perhaps as scientists, we might also see this as kind of a natural experiment and try to find out what kind of systemic changes are possible on short notice. But of course, I know that many different forces are at work, and of course there are very different conclusions drawn by other people.
Yeah, but I think this is true. Like one of my friends said, he made a comparison. Like it's a bit strange to study the Corona crisis because you're in it yourself, right? Like you're studying the Petri dish, but you're in the Petri dish yourself. But this is, especially if you look at disruptions, like this is the most interesting disruption ever, right? So I think our role should be to kind of make sense of this insane amount of data and stuff and things that are happening, and make sense of it and see how can you at least make sure that the outcome of this is not unnecessarily bad, I guess. Like you can't really call it good, but
maybe I can add here, and I already said it before, but I think that understanding what are the good things that we can keep out of it, that are also, that will help us actually to get this decoupling, and that can also help the economy while reducing, so making this distinction and trying to work out with the different sectors, the industry, the government, local municipalities, and consumers, to realize on each part what are the changes that we want to make based on what happened and we learn, or to maintain from what happened and try to keep maintaining it while, harvesting the environmental gains, but not giving up on the economy or helping it back to recover. I think that's where we can really help as a research society, because we can really pinpoint on those opportunities that make sense to maintain or not, and try to think on solutions how to maintain it, you know. I think industry is already realizing, hey, closing all of our banks most of the time and giving online services online is actually good for us. We didn't lose anything. We gave a bit better service, whatever, okay? Or you know, in Israel, there are IT companies now that just close their offices, nothing to do with the pandemic. That's it, released 1,000 employees to work permanently from home, starting immediately, even if the pandemic restriction will be over, etc. Just close their offices, and they're in good shape business-wise. They just realize that they don't really need the office, and if they need it, they will have a small place for meetings once in a while when it's critical to have face-to-face or something. So, so it will take time, I think, for the different players to realize what's good for them and what they can learn, you know, to maintain.
Yeah.
Very interesting point, and makes me wonder, what if universities or students realize that it can be done online?
I think they already did.
For many of us. But these are very good points. What do you think? And this question is open to the entire floor, to everybody. Do we, as a field of study, as a community, do we have the right tools to work and provide relevant answers in real time, or do we need to develop new approaches?
Well, I have like, I think like my approach for this is just speaking for myself, but I did basically semi-structured interviews, and that's the only thing I could really think of, because everything else is just so much up in the air. And the semi-structured interviews, they're kind of good in a certain way because you get a feel for what's going on, but yeah, I would struggle to see how you can do modeling. We've been trying to make some system dynamics models, stuff like that, but at the same time, it's just so far removed from the current way that the world that you used to work. You know, like in modeling, you can like make one change and then see what happens, but it's really hard to change everything simultaneously. Yeah, what does the model tell you? Like nothing comes out of it. So I think like maybe our tools are not really appropriate for this, but then at the same time, no tools will be really appropriate. But I think our way of thinking is super appropriate, like the system level thinking. That's really what psychology can bring that other disciplines maybe have a bit less. So I think it's really critical for us, especially as communities, to step up and try to engage with policymakers when they deal with COVID-19.
Thank you, Benjamin.
I
Yeah.
can add. I don't want to. No one else has to. Anyone else want to comment?
It's okay, Vered. Go ahead and.
Okay. One thing for me is that just, you know, and I'm not a consumer behavior or survey person or even not econometrics person per se. You know, I do a lot of this research, but this is not my, you know, my main interest. But I figure out that you actually need to walk and get this input first many times from the field, from the people, if it's managers, if it's consumers, you know. And then for me, and it's not, you know, it's a long-term process and research, but how do you take such survey results and actually use them for the next stage when we want to use our existing methods, you know, and trying to quantify using LCA, MFA, other methods that we might choose to use. How can we inform those with the survey results? And even if we go on a system dynamics model or agent-based modeling, the interface of the survey and statistics side into those models, I think there is a lot of room for innovation there in models and methods development still for our society, and for our community, but it will require real good cooperation with survey people. You know, it could be in different levels, but and econometrics people, and it's not straightforward because each is different method, different discipline, different, you know, and making this walk between, you know, interdisciplinary teams is something to keep working on, I think.
Yeah, great. Very good points.
Well, perhaps I can add, I think that, I mean, in a crisis of this size, all the parameters derived with econometric methods actually break down, yeah? So, so I think econometrists will have to wait for another 5 years before, so that they have a certain time frame where perhaps there are new kind of relations emerge that you can detect with these kinds of methods. Yeah, but at the moment, they probably have a hard time to.
So in the meantime, we can develop the methods, how to interface the results until they have data to work with.
A very good observation too. Thank you, everybody. We are running out of time, but yeah, I think we did get a chance to see in this session how we actually do manage to inform um, uh, in real time through various approaches, both by looking at the historical data and through approaches and methods that maybe have not been very common in industrial ecology historically. But we are adapting and adopting them very quickly, which is beautiful in my opinion. And there is a lot more to discuss. But before we close, I would like to thank the speakers again and everyone who participated. At the peak, we had over 60 participants on Zoom and YouTube, which makes this a pretty big session, in my opinion. So thank you to everyone. We would like to use this opportunity to also announce that the presentations are going to be made available online on the ISIE website eventually. We just have to figure out a few technical details before they appear there. There will also be a conference website and an abstract submission page for all of our community to have the opportunity to participate and present their research eventually. The speed is going to be pretty slow because we don't have sessions in parallel like a face-to-face conference. But the next session we can already announce is going to be held in August, probably late August because of summer vacation in many locations in the Northern Hemisphere. And the topic is going to be spatially explicit material flow analysis. And also be on the lookout for future session topics, which are going to be in the next upcoming months, which are listed here on the screen. And eventually, we also hope that there will be less restrictions, and we will also have regular old biannual socioeconomic metabolism conference. So the dates and location and so forth are still to be announced, but these two conferences will be held in parallel, regardless of each other. The good old face-to-face one and this perpetual online one in parallel. So again, thank you all for joining in today, and we want to hear from you, comments, questions, suggestions, anything. The SEM section board is very enthusiastic about this and would like to keep the conversation going. So once more, thank you very much, and we will see you next time.